I've always prided myself on being the rational one in our relationship. Steady, reliable, the kind of guy who never lets his emotions get the better of him. So when Laura announced that she'd been selected for an important series of meetings in Boston, I was more than happy to tag along. At 43, I've come to expect a few surprises in life, but nothing could have prepared me for what unfolded on that trip. From the moment we landed in Boston, there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite place. Laura, 39 and ever the epitome of composure, kept her cool as she outlined the schedule for the 5 days ahead. "It's just a few meetings," she'd said with a smile that I now realize was more practiced than genuine. The city buzzed with energy, and while I was supposed to be her supportive companion, a nagging thought kept whispering that things weren't entirely as they seemed. The first couple of days were relatively routine. I spent most of my time exploring the historic streets, wandering through art galleries, and occasionally accompanying her to brief sessions at her meetings. Always waiting outside in the cool Boston air, watching as she engaged with people I didn't recognize. There was a strange detachment in her eyes when she spoke of these encounters, as if she were reciting lines from a well-rehearsed play rather than discussing genuine business deals. I chalked it up to stress, or perhaps a side effect of jet lag. After all, it was supposed to be just a business trip. Then came the night that unraveled everything. I'd been in our modest hotel room, idly watching a late-night news report, when I saw the bulletin. All flights out of Boston had been canceled due to a severe storm. A severe storm in Boston was nothing new. After all, the Northeast is known for its sudden tempests, but what truly unsettled me was the realization that Laura had never mentioned any possibility of being stranded. I couldn't remember a single time she'd hinted that the weather might affect her schedule. In fact, not once did she reach out to inform me of any changes. Our communication had been sporadic at best since we landed, and now, as the storm raged outside and I listened to the repeated announcements of flight cancellations, I felt a tightening in my chest. I tried calling her on her cell, but every attempt ended with silence. Was it that her phone was off, or had the storm somehow knocked out the service? That explanation didn't sit right with me. I knew her habits well. Laura wasn't one to leave me in the dark, especially on something as significant as a business trip. I spent a restless hour pacing the room, trying to piece together my thoughts. The situation was becoming less about an inconvenient travel delay and more about a stark, gnawing suspicion that there was something else going on. What truly got to me was the realization that, despite all the supposed importance of her meetings, there was a palpable absence of any genuine excitement in her voice when she had talked about the trip before departure. It was as if the business trip was merely a cover, a facade that she had constructed meticulously. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the last to know, that there was an entire conversation happening somewhere else, one in which I wasn't a participant. And now, stranded in a city where the storm had effectively trapped us, the unanswered questions loomed larger than ever. I sat on the edge of the neatly made bed, the quiet hum of the storm outside accentuating the silence in the room. The click of the door handle as I tried once more to dial her number felt like a ticking clock counting down to some inevitable confrontation. Every unanswered ring, every pause in the static, was a reminder of how distant she had suddenly become. I began to replay every moment from the past few days, searching desperately for clues, a missed glance, an offhand comment, anything that might explain the growing chasm between us. Yet, nothing definitive emerged from my memories, only fragments of conversations and moments that now felt tinged with hidden meanings. As I sat there, wrestling with my thoughts, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm was more than just a natural disaster. Was it a convenient cover for something deeper and more unsettling? I recalled how, earlier in the evening, Laura had hurriedly left the room with an urgency that seemed out of place. At the time, I'd brushed it off as a minor detail, a simple matter of getting to her next meeting. But now, that small detail took on a much darker hue. Had she been avoiding me deliberately? Or was there an explanation that I was too blinded by my own complacency to see? The rain pounded relentlessly against the window, as I stared out at the dark, swirling sky. The storm's fury mirrored the turmoil inside me. I felt a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a creeping sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite shake off. In that moment, every instinct I had screamed that something wasn't right, that behind the polished veneer of her so-called business trip, there lay secrets I had yet to uncover. I closed my eyes, trying to summon the courage to confront her once I got a hold of her again. I told myself that there must be a logical explanation, that the chaos of a storm was simply the backdrop for an unforeseen logistical nightmare. Yet, deep down, a more unsettling thought took root. Perhaps the storm wasn't just weather. It was the catalyst for revelations I wasn't ready to face. And as I sat there alone in the dim light of our hotel room, I couldn't help but wonder if, when the skies finally cleared, I would be staring at a truth more turbulent than the storm itself. The night stretched on, punctuated only by the sporadic updates on the weather and my own mounting anxiety. In the eerie quiet of that hour, I realized that nothing was as it seemed. The business trip, the storm, and her sudden silence were all pieces of a puzzle that I was only beginning to comprehend. And with every unanswered call and every flash of lightning outside, the shadows of doubt grew longer, hinting at secrets waiting to be unearthed, secrets that might change everything I thought I knew about Laura and our life together. That night marked the beginning of a journey into uncertainty, one that would force me to question every assumption and confront truths that I'd long preferred to ignore. I didn't yet know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. The calm I had once known was gone, replaced by a storm of doubts and mysteries that would demand to be resolved, no matter how painful the revelations might be. I couldn't sleep after the storm's ominous symphony had lulled the city into a heavy, uneasy quiet. Restlessness drove me to my laptop, where I reluctantly opened the security camera app, a digital window into our home, a place that suddenly felt as foreign as the truth I was beginning to suspect. I navigated to the recordings, scrolling back through the day, trying to find anything that might explain the oddities that had plagued my thoughts. At precisely 23:58, the screen froze on an image that made my heart sink. There, on our doorstep under the harsh glare of a street lamp, stood Laura. But this wasn't the Laura who had boarded a flight for Boston in a neat business suit and carry-on luggage. This was a woman in a short, black dress that clung to her in a way that felt far too deliberate. She had no suitcase in hand, no sign of the business trip she'd so confidently described. Instead, her appearance was incongruous with the story she'd told me for days. I watched in disbelief as the feed continued. A sleek black sedan pulled up beside our house. The car's door swung open, and without a word or a glance of hesitation, Laura slid into the passenger seat. The vehicle accelerated almost immediately, its tires squealing briefly against the pavement as it sped away into the night. There was no pause at the door, no moment of hesitation, as if she'd cared to glance back at the place she'd once called home. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The logical explanations I had clung to, the storm, the communication blackout, began to crumble under the weight of this evidence. That Laura, the woman I'd trusted implicitly, was not the person she appeared to be. In that single, silent moment captured on camera, I saw a stranger, a woman whose hurried exit and questionable attire undermined everything I thought I knew about her. I sat back, my pulse thundering in my ears as I replayed the clip over and over. Each time, the details etched themselves deeper into my mind. The stark black dress, the absence of any travel gear, the cold efficiency with which she merged into the night. How could this be part of a business trip? The narrative she had spun now felt like nothing more than an elaborate cover-up, a ruse designed to hide secrets too dangerous or too personal to share. Every detail gnawed at me. I remembered how, during the early part of our trip, Laura had seemed distracted, her eyes occasionally glazing over when she mentioned her schedule. I had chalked it up to jet lag or the stress of her supposed meetings. But now, Confronted with this stark, unyielding truth, I wondered if I had been the fool in our carefully constructed life together. The discrepancy was glaring. A business trip should come with a professional wardrobe, not a seductive dress paired with a mysterious late-night escape. The evidence was undeniable. My heart pounded with a mixture of betrayal, anger, and a deep-seated dread of what other lies might be waiting to be uncovered. The woman in the security footage was a ghost of the Laura I thought I knew, her departure shrouded in as much secrecy as the storm that had stranded me in this city. It was as if she had carefully chosen the perfect moment, a night when nature itself conspired to drown out all the usual signals, to stage her escape, leaving me with nothing but the cold glow of the camera and a mounting sense of disbelief. Questions whirled in my head, each one more disconcerting than the last. Who was she meeting in that car? What could possibly warrant such a clandestine appearance? And why had she felt the need to hide her true intentions behind a fabricated business trip? Every unanswered question festered, deepening the wound of betrayal. I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't just a coincidental backdrop, but rather a carefully orchestrated diversion for something far more insidious. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the darkened screen as I tried to piece together the puzzle. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was now crumbling, eroded by a flood of evidence that pointed to a reality I wasn't prepared to face. Every detail, the precise timestamp of 23:58, the seductive choice of attire, the sudden disappearance of the car, spoke of a plan executed with meticulous care, as if every moment had been rehearsed for maximum impact. In that quiet, oppressive moment, the room seemed to close in around me. The hum of the laptop fan and the distant, rhythmic patter of rain on the window were the only sounds, each one underscoring the isolation I felt. I was alone with a truth that was more painful than I had ever imagined, a truth that demanded confrontation, no matter how shattering it might be. I had to know who Laura really was, or rather, who she had become in the shadows of her secrets. The more I watched, the more I realized that nothing was as it seemed. The comfortable lies I had clung to were giving way to a narrative filled with deception and hidden desires. It wasn't just about a canceled flight or a missed call. It was about the systematic unraveling of a life I thought I understood. The image of her slipping into that car, her eyes reflecting the fleeting light of a street lamp, haunted me with the certainty that my world was built on a foundation of carefully hidden truths. As the seconds slipped by and the footage ended, a numb determination took hold of me. I couldn't remain passive any longer. The evidence was irrefutable, and I knew that I needed to confront the situation head-on. I stared at the empty space on the screen, feeling a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The Laura I loved had walked out the door that night, leaving behind a trail of questions and a chasm of trust that might never be bridged. My fingers hovered over my phone, contemplating the next move. I had to reach out to her, to demand an explanation for this carefully staged deception. But a part of me hesitated. Was I prepared to confront a version of her that I no longer recognized? The thought of unearthing even deeper secrets filled me with a cold dread. Yet, in the silence of that moment, one thing was clear. I could no longer ignore the evidence staring me in the face. I had to step into the fray, to challenge the lies that had been fed to me for far too long. The rain intensified outside, as if punctuating the gravity of the situation. Each drop on the window mirrored the mounting tension in my heart. A relentless reminder that nothing could wash away the stain of betrayal. I knew that this was only the beginning. The revelations of that single, damning clip were just the tip of the iceberg, hinting at deeper, darker secrets waiting to be uncovered. And as I sat there, engulfed by a storm both outside and within, I steeled myself for the inevitable confrontation, a reckoning that would force me to confront not only the woman I thought I knew, but also the painful reality of the life we had constructed together. I closed the security app, the glow of the screen fading into the dark corners of the room. The evidence was out there, silent and unyielding, and with it came a call to action that I could no longer ignore. The trust that had once bound us was shattered, and I was left with the daunting task of piecing together the truth from the fragments of a life that had been nothing more than a carefully woven tapestry of lies. There was no turning back now. I had seen too much, and the night had irrevocably changed everything. With a heavy heart and a mind teeming with questions, I resolved to seek the truth, no matter how painful or elusive it might be. The confrontation loomed ahead, inevitable and fraught with uncertainty, but it was a step I had to take. The storm outside was a fitting prelude to the tempest that was about to engulf my world, a reminder that sometimes the darkest nights bring forth the most brutal revelations. And as I sat in the silence of that long, restless night, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I was sitting in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside, when I heard the soft click of the front door. Every nerve in my body was on edge. Each creak of the floor, each subtle sound a reminder of the secrets that had begun to unravel. I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd seen on the security cameras, and I knew that the time for silent brooding was over. I needed answers. The door swung open, and there she was. Laura stepped into the room with an expression that flickered in an instant from surprise to something much more guarded, an almost imperceptible shift that set my mind racing. Her eyes widened briefly, as if caught off guard. Then she offered a light, almost dismissive smile. "Oh, you're still awake?" she said, as if my sleepless vigil were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I couldn't let her off the hook this easily. "How's Boston?" I asked, my tone measured but laced with a quiet intensity. The question hung in the air, and for a split second, it felt like the entire room was waiting for her response. For a long moment, Laura hesitated. Her eyes flickered, darting away from mine as if searching for an escape. Finally, she exhaled slowly, forcing a nonchalant air into her voice. "Boston was exhausting," she said. "The flights were delayed twice. It was just tiring, you know? Delayed twice." The words echoed in my mind, clashing with the memory of the storm I'd heard about and the singular, overwhelming cancellation message that had initially raised my suspicions. I felt my pulse quicken. The explanation was too neat, too rehearsed. "Twice," I repeated, tilting my head as I searched her face for any sign of genuine fatigue or perhaps an inkling of a hidden truth. "That seems odd, don't you think?" Her eyes shifted, the mask of casual innocence faltering for a brief moment. Well, yes," she admitted softly, her voice betraying an underlying tension. "The first delay was due to the storm, and then there was another technical issue. It was all just really frustrating. Frustrating indeed, but I wasn't convinced. I had been piecing together every detail since that damning clip on the security app. Laura in that short black dress, no suitcase in sight, and that sleek car speeding off into the night without a backward glance. None of it fit with the story of a simple business trip hampered by bad weather. I stepped from my seat, moving closer into the pool of dim light, the shadows dancing around us like silent witnesses to this unraveling drama. "In your meetings?" I pressed. "You said you had important sessions lined up, yet last night you didn't even mention a single one. Instead, I saw." I paused, letting the memory of that incriminating image sink in. "I saw you in a short black dress, without any sign of a professional agenda." "Explain that." Her eyes widened, and I caught a glimpse of something raw and unfiltered, a flicker of panic mixed with resignation. I had a dinner event," she stammered, a weak attempt at deflection. "It was the only thing that fit into my schedule once the delays started piling up." "A dinner event?" The answer was flimsy, and it did nothing to align the pieces of the puzzle. I couldn't hide the disappointment and hurt that crept into my voice. "A dinner event doesn't require a short black dress, Laura." It doesn't explain the absence of any luggage or the car that whisked you away so abruptly. And you never called me to say you'd be late or that plans had changed. Why wouldn't you? Her gaze faltered, and she took an involuntary step back, as if the truth she was guarding had suddenly become too heavy to bear. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken confessions and a shared understanding that nothing in our relationship had been as simple or as straightforward as it appeared. I just didn't think it was important, she murmured, the lie tumbling out with a hint of desperation. I thought it was just a minor change, nothing to worry about. I shook my head slowly, feeling the sting of betrayal intensify with each passing second. A minor change? I repeated, the phrase tasting bitter on my tongue. When every detail of this trip feels staged, when your entire explanation seems designed to hide something bigger, can you really tell me it's just a minor change? Her eyes glistened with something I couldn't quite decipher. Fear, regret, or maybe just the dawning realization that her carefully constructed facade was collapsing in the face of undeniable evidence. Jacob, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Please let me explain. But the explanation I craved wasn't one of hurried justifications or contrived excuses. I needed the truth, the messy, painful truth that had been hidden behind delayed flights and fashionable disguises. I need the truth, Laura, I said softly, stepping closer so that our faces were inches apart. I need to know what's really going on. This isn't about exhaustion or travel delays. It's about honesty, something that's been missing between us for far too long. For a long moment, she said nothing, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder and the soft patter of rain against the windows. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "There's so much you don't know." I pressed on, every word laden with the hurt of unspoken betrayals. "Then tell me," I urged, "tell me everything. I deserve that much." Her eyes flickered with tears that threatened to spill over. And in that vulnerable moment, I saw a woman not entirely alien to me, a woman who had once shared my dreams and my fears, now caught in a web of secrets she could no longer maintain. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice quivering with the weight of years of hidden truths. "I did what I thought I had to do. I just didn't know how to tell you." I stepped back, the pain in her words clashing with the betrayal I'd felt since that fateful night. "What did you do, Laura?" I asked, each word a mix of longing for the past and dread of the future. "How does a business trip turn into a night of deceit, a silent departure in a dress that's not meant for boardrooms?" She looked down, unable to meet my eyes, as if the truth were too painful to face directly. The shadows between us seemed to grow thicker, the distance widening with every passing second. "There are things about my life, things I've been trying to keep hidden, even from you," she whispered. "I thought I could handle it, that I could protect you from the fallout. But it's gotten out of hand." I felt a surge of anger mixed with sorrow. "Protect me from what?" I demanded softly, though the intensity of my voice belied my inner turmoil. "From the truth? Or from the parts of you that you're too scared to show?" Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met mine for a brief, agonizing moment. "It's not that simple," she replied, her voice raw. "There are people involved, things I never wanted to be a part of, but I got caught up in it all. I thought I could manage it on my own, but now I can't." Every word she uttered sent a tremor through the carefully constructed world I had believed in. The simple narrative of a business trip was crumbling, replaced by a maze of half-truths, lies, and a reality that was more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides, trying to contain the storm of emotions rising within me. Betrayal, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. "You lied to me, Laura," I said, my voice low and steady, even as my heart pounded in my chest. "Not just about Boston, but about everything. Who are you really seeing? What kind of dinner event requires this much secrecy? And why? Why would you let our lives be turned upside down by something you kept hidden?" She reached out as if to touch me, but then pulled her hand back, her eyes filling with remorse. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, the admission heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, Jakob. I truly am. But there are things in my life, things I got involved with that I can't just walk away from. I try to protect you by keeping it secret, thinking that if I handled it on my own, you wouldn't get hurt." Hurt. That word stung, not just because of the betrayal, but because it underscored how far apart we'd grown. I searched her face for the woman I once knew, the woman who had shared dreams and plans for our future. Instead, I saw a stranger who had hidden so much from me that the trust we once shared now lay in ruins. "Protect me?" I echoed bitterly. "By lying to me? By making me a part of a facade that's tearing us apart? How can I trust you when I don't even know which version of you is real?" Tears began to stream down her face as she took a tentative step toward me. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I wish I could explain everything, but it's not that simple. I'm in too deep, and I didn't want you to be dragged into it. I was trying to keep you safe." The silence that fell between us was thick with the weight of our shared history. The laughter, the dreams, the plans, and now, the lies that had come to define the space between us. I looked into her eyes, searching desperately for a sign of the truth, for any glimmer that might suggest that the woman I loved was still there beneath the layers of deception. "I need more than apologies, Laura," I said softly, my voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and anger. "I need to understand what you've done, who you're involved with, and why you felt you had no choice but to lie. I can't keep living in this shadow of doubt." Her gaze faltered, and in that moment, the mask of innocence was stripped away entirely. "I don't know if I can give you all the answers you want right now," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I promise you, everything will come out eventually. Just please try to understand." Understand? How could I possibly understand the labyrinth of secrets that had suddenly become our reality? I felt my heart break a little more with each passing second. The man who had once believed in a life of mutual honesty, now faced with a future shrouded in uncertainty and betrayal. "Then start by telling me who these people are," I urged, my tone both pleading and commanding. "I need to know what I'm up against here. If you're protecting me, then let me in on what's really happening." Her eyes filled with tears once again, and for a moment, the bravado was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that left me both sympathetic and even more determined to uncover the truth. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she whispered, her voice heavy with remorse. "I wish I could say it's all simple, but it's not. There are forces at play that I can't fully control, and I'm afraid that the deeper I get, the more dangerous it becomes for both of us." At that, I felt a chill run down my spine, part dread, part sorrow. The world we had built together was no longer just our own. It was entangled with hidden agendas and dangerous secrets that threatened to consume us. In the dim light of our living room, as the rain pounded relentlessly outside, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I stepped back, my mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. "Laura," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room, "I need you to promise me that we'll face this together. No more secrets, no more lies. If there's danger, we face it as one. I can't do this alone." She looked up at me, eyes red and brimming with tears, and for a long moment, I saw the familiar woman I had once loved, the one who believed in us despite everything. "I promise," she murmured, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I'll tell you everything, I swear it." In that fragile moment, as the storm raged outside and our past and future collided in the space between us, I realized that our lives had reached a crossroads. The confrontation had opened a door to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Yet the only way forward was through that darkness together, or apart. And as I stood there in the living room, bathed in the uncertain glow of half-light and the echo of our whispered promises, I knew that the next steps would define everything. Who we were, and what we'd become in the wake of all these lies. I couldn't let the mounting tension fade into silence. With a steady, low tone, I said, "You've never flown." I checked the flight schedule. In that moment, I watched her face flicker. First a flash of shock, then an immediate hardening into defensiveness. Her eyes narrowed, and before I could press further, she shot back. Are you following me like a spy?" I didn't rise to the bait of her accusation. Instead, I maintained my calm and met her gaze squarely. "Who gave you a ride?" I asked. The question cut through the charged air, and for a moment, her gaze dropped, and she looked away, as if the truth was too painful to face. Her posture stiffened, and she fumbled for a response. It doesn't matter," she mumbled, her voice quivering ever so slightly, as if she was desperately trying to change the subject. But I wasn't about to let her deflect this time. I needed to see past the defensive veneer, to uncover the reality behind the carefully constructed lies. I sat there in the dim glow of the living room, the steady patter of rain against the windows echoing the heavy beats of my heart. Every second stretched out as I waited for her to offer a real explanation, not another rehearsed line. The evidence was irrefutable. She had never flown, yet she'd insisted on a narrative that only deepened the mystery. Her eyes flicked briefly to the floor before darting back to meet mine with a nervous intensity. I just thought I could handle it on my own," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt incomplete, as if the real story was still locked away behind layers of fear and regret. I took a slow breath, trying to steady the torrent of emotions swirling within me. "Handle what, Laura?" I pressed gently but firmly. "This isn't about following you or being a spy. It's about trust. I deserve to know what's really going on." For a long, heavy moment, silence reigned between us, punctuated only by the soft rumble of distant thunder. I could sense the storm outside was mirroring the tempest inside our living room. A storm of secrets, deceit, and the slow disintegration of everything I thought we shared. Her eyes wandered to some distant point beyond the window, and she seemed to shrink into herself, her defensive stance crumbling just a fraction. "I didn't want to worry you," she murmured, the words laden with an anguish I hadn't heard before. "I thought if I kept things to myself, I could protect you." But that was no longer enough. I had seen too many signs. The flight never taken, the car that whisked you away without a backward glance, the gaps in your story, to let any more of these half-truths slide by unnoticed. Every lie, every evasive glance, was tearing us further apart. I kept my voice soft yet resolute. "Laura, I need you to be honest with me. I'm not trying to control you. I just need to understand what's happening. Who really gave you a ride?" Her eyes darted away once again, a look of desperation flickering briefly across her face before she tried to divert the conversation. "This isn't something you should worry about right now," she said, her tone slipping into a hurried, almost panicked cadence, as if the very mention of the truth would unleash something uncontrollable. I could feel the weight of her unspoken words hanging in the air. The room felt simultaneously too small and too vast, filled with an unbearable tension that left no room for the comfortable lies we once believed in. The evidence of her deception was laid bare in every detail, and now it demanded an explanation that I was determined to receive, even if it meant dismantling the world we had built together. As the storm raged outside, I sat there waiting for her next words, each second stretching into an eternity of uncertainty and hurt. I knew that this confrontation was only the beginning. The truth, once uncovered, would force us to face parts of ourselves we had long tried to hide, and the road ahead promised to be far more treacherous than either of us had ever imagined. I sat back down after our first confrontation, the weight of Laura's half-truths still heavy in the air. I needed more answers, something that could explain everything. With trembling fingers, I switched over to the security camera feed for the street outside our house. I hoped that another angle might offer some clarity, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. On the screen, there he was, the man who'd given her that ride. My stomach dropped as I recognized his face. It was Owen. Owen, my best friend for 14 years. The same man who'd stood by my side through thick and thin, the one I'd trusted with my deepest secrets. Seeing him there, on the other camera, confirmed a betrayal I hadn't dared to imagine. The man who was supposed to be like a brother now lurked in the background of our unraveling lives, his face a silent witness to the deception that had invaded my world. I turned to Laura, whose expression had already shifted the moment the truth was exposed. There was no more feigned innocence in her eyes. Instead, a sneer played on her lips as if daring me to challenge her. "You know him, right?" she said, the words dripping with condescension. I felt my heart break all over again, each syllable echoing in the quiet room like a death knell for the life I thought I knew. Even as the shock threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to stay composed. I couldn't let my emotions spiral out of control. Not now, when I needed answers more than ever. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled out my phone and dialed Owen's number. My voice came out steadier than I felt as I said, "I know everything, Owen." For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end of the line. The pause was heavy, filled with the hum of an unseen storm and the pounding of my own heart. Then, just as I was about to worry that the call had dropped, I heard a nervous sigh, a short, shaky exhalation that spoke volumes. It was the sound of a man caught off guard, of someone who suddenly realized that the carefully constructed facade could no longer hide the truth. That sigh was the only response I received. The silence stretched on, laden with unspoken guilt and regret, before I managed to ask, "Owen, what's going on?" But even as the words left my lips, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In that charged silence, the reality of the betrayal settled over me like a shroud. Owen, the friend I'd trusted implicitly, had been entwined in this web of deception with Laura. My world was crumbling, and the foundation of trust that had held everything together was now shattered beyond repair. As I waited for him to speak, every second of silence felt like an eternity, a stark reminder that the truth was out there, even if it was more painful than I could have ever imagined. I braced myself for whatever came next, knowing that the path ahead would be filled with revelations that would redefine everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the people closest to me. I remember the moment the final blow landed like a punch I never saw coming. Laura's eyes glinted with a mixture of defiance and contempt as she let a bitter laugh escape her. "Do you think it's just Owen?" she said, her tone laced with cynicism that left no room for denial. I froze, the words echoing in the tense silence between us. For a heartbeat, I could only stare, unable to comprehend how much deeper this betrayal could go. I forced a steady, albeit hollow, voice as I asked, "What do you mean?" Her smile twisted into something almost contemptuous, and she replied, "There was also Brian, your colleague. For 15 months. The room spun. 15 months. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of a reality I'd long thought secure. The shock was overwhelming, and every instinct in me screamed to recoil, to retreat into a shell of disbelief. But I couldn't let myself fall apart. Not here, not now. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers and dialed Brian's number, the cold metal of the device grounding me in this nightmarish moment. When the call connected, I didn't waste a second. "Brian, we need to talk," I said, my voice a blend of icy resolve and raw pain. I could almost hear the hesitation in his silence, the uneasy pause on the other end that spoke volumes before a nervous sigh finally broke the stillness. After that long, excruciating pause, his voice came through, shaky and uncertain. "Jacob," he began, but I cut him off sharply. "Brian, I know everything. The admission hung in the air like a curse. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of our disconnected heartbeats and the static of an uneasy line. Then, with a wavering cadence that betrayed his guilt, he managed, I didn't think you'd find out this way. Find out what, Brian? I demanded, each word laced with a mix of anger and disbelief. That you've been involved with Laura? That you've been betraying me, betraying our friendship, for 15 months? There was silence again, long and heavy, as if every second were a verdict. Finally, his voice returned, lower and filled with regret. I never meant for it to hurt you, Jacob. Everything got out of hand. I didn't know how to say goodbye. His words were clumsy, inadequate, and they only deepened the wound. Hurt me? I repeated bitterly. Brian, you weren't just hurting me. You're demolishing everything I believed in. You and Laura. I trusted both of you. I trusted you as my friend and confidant. The line fell silent once more. That silence was more damning than any words could be, each moment a reminder of how deeply I had been deceived. I ended the call, my hands still trembling as I set the phone aside and turned back to look at Laura. Her eyes, once a source of warmth and familiarity, now burned with a smug detachment. You always thought you were so innocent, didn't you, Jacob? So naive that you could believe in loyalty, in honesty, she said, her tone dripping with scorn. I'm just showing you the real world, the messy, complicated, and sometimes cruel reality. I struggled to steady my breathing, the taste of betrayal bitter on my tongue. Why, Laura? I finally managed, my voice raw with pain. Why did you do it? Why involve Owen? Why hide behind lies for so long? How could you let this go on for 15 months? She shrugged nonchalantly, as if the enormity of her betrayal were merely a trivial detail. Because sometimes secrets have a way of fester, Jacob, and maybe I got tired of pretending everything was perfect. Maybe I wanted to be free of the constraints of our little lie. Her words stung more than I could have imagined, each syllable a dagger in the fragile remnants of trust one once held dear. I looked at her, trying to decipher any hint of remorse, any sign that the woman I loved was still there beneath the veneer of defiance. But all I saw was someone who had carefully calculated every move, someone who had orchestrated this elaborate deception with a precision that left me feeling utterly small and exposed. The enormity of the situation began to settle in, a crushing, overwhelming realization that my world was irreparably shattered. Not only had Laura betrayed me, but two of the people I trusted most had conspired in a way that stripped away any semblance of certainty or security. My best friend, Owen, had played his part in this dark chapter, and now Brian, the colleague I once admired and respected, had revealed himself as another architect of my downfall. I sank to the floor of our dimly lit living room, the weight of their treachery pressing down on me like an unbearable burden. Tears streamed down my face, not just for the loss of a partner, but for the loss of innocence, for the collapse of a world I had believed in so fiercely. Every memory, every shared laugh and secret moment now felt like a cruel joke, a series of lies that had led me to this devastating point. In that oppressive silence, with the storm outside having finally died down, I was left alone with the wreckage of my shattered heart. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the cold hardness of the floor beneath me, and wondered how I would ever be able to piece together the remnants of a life built on trust. The faces of Owen and Brian haunted my every thought, their betrayals a stark reminder that sometimes the people you hold closest can become the ones who break you the most. I typed out a final, desperate note on my phone, a message to myself, a plea for some semblance of understanding. I trusted them. I believed in a love and friendship that were nothing more than elaborate lies. How do I move on from this? How do I learn to trust again when everything I knew is tainted by betrayal? There was no answer, only the echo of my own despair. The room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb of broken promises. The final blow had not just exposed the lies. It had decimated every illusion I had clung to for so long. Now, all that remained was the bitter truth. My life, my love, and my trust were gone, irretrievably lost in a maze of deceit. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every shattered dream and every broken vow, and whispered a final goodbye to the past. The future loomed ahead, dark and uncertain, a path I wasn't sure I had the strength to walk. But as I sat there in the silence of my broken world, I knew one thing with painful clarity: nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, I made a silent vow. I would one day rise from these ruins, piece together the fragments of who I once was, and learn to trust again, even if it meant starting from scratch in a world where betrayal lurked in every shadow. For now, though, I had to face the cold, harsh reality that the lives I once cherished were nothing more than carefully constructed facades, destined to crumble under the weight of truth. And so, with my heart heavy and my soul scarred, I stepped away from that life, leaving behind the ghosts of betrayal and the remnants of a love that was never as perfect as I had believed. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with pain and the possibility of further deception, but it was mine to travel, one step at a time, even in the darkest of nights. I reached a point where the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayals, the countless nights of shattered trust, became too unbearable to carry any longer. That morning, as the sun hesitantly pushed its light through the stormy remnants of my despair, I made my decision. I was done with the facade, done with living in a house that held nothing but memories of deceit. I called a real estate agent and told them to list the house immediately. I didn't leave any room for negotiation. It was time for me to reclaim my life. I had already prepared myself for what was to come. The phone call with Laura later that day confirmed it. Her voice trembled, laced with panic as she pleaded, "You can't do this, it's our house." But I didn't hesitate, and I didn't waver. I said coldly, "Not anymore." Those words, brief and resolute, marked the end of everything I once knew. That night, under a sky heavy with the promise of rain and an uncertain future, I packed the few belongings that still mattered. There was no time for goodbyes or second thoughts. I left in the darkness, taking no familiar route, and letting the open road become my guide. Every mile I put between myself and that place was a step toward freedom, a freedom that had been buried under years of betrayal and heartache. Before I left, I took one last painful act. I deleted every single photo of Laura from my phone. With each image wiped away, it felt like I was erasing the lingering remnants of a past that had imprisoned me for too long. I scrolled through the memories one final time, each snapshot a reminder of promises made and then broken. And then, with a final, resolute tap, I let them vanish into the digital void. Almost as if the universe were testing me one last time. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. For a split second, I stared at the screen, a part of me expecting Laura to be on the line, desperate and pleading for another chance. But I knew better. I knew that if I let that call in, I would be allowing her, and by extension the ghosts of the past, back into my life. Without a second thought, I deleted the message, severing that final thread of connection. As I drove away into the night, the cool air rushing through the window, an unfamiliar lightness filled me. For the first time in 6 years, I felt free. Free from the toxic web of lies spun by Laura. Free from the betrayals of a best friend and a trusted colleague. And free from the suffocating memories that had haunted every corner of that house. The road ahead was uncertain, winding through darkness and doubt, but it was mine to travel. I wasn't burdened by the past anymore, and for the first time, the future looked like a blank canvas waiting to be painted with my own choices. Every mile I put behind me was a step away from a life defined by deception, a step towards discovering who I truly was without the shadows of betrayal looming over me. I could feel the tension in my chest ease with every passing moment, replaced by a cautious optimism. I wasn't naive enough to believe that the pain would vanish overnight, but I did know that I no longer had to live under the weight of someone else's lies. In the quiet solitude of that night, as I merged onto an unfamiliar highway, I allowed myself a rare moment of introspection. I thought about the years I had spent entangled in a web of secrets. Years where every conversation had been a careful dance around the truth. Every smile a mask hiding deeper scars. The realization that I had been complicit in my own confinement was both sobering and liberating. I had clung to a version of reality that wasn't mine, one that was built on illusions and half-truths. And now, with a decisive act, I was reclaiming it all. The world outside was vast and indifferent, the road stretching endlessly ahead like a promise of redemption. I didn't know where I was headed, and I didn't care. For the first time in as long as I could remember, the uncertainty of the future didn't terrify me. It excited me. Every mile was a declaration. I was done being defined by the past. I was ready to write a new story, one where I was in control, where I wasn't bound by the chains of betrayal and regret. I kept my phone off, the screen dark, as if to shield me from any unexpected calls or reminders of the life I was leaving behind. There was a final irony in that, a message from an unknown number once again. But this time, there was no hesitation, no conflict. I simply let it be. It was just another echo of a past that no longer had power over me. In that moment, as I drove through the night with nothing but the hum of the engine and the whisper of the wind for company, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: true freedom. Not the reckless, headlong freedom of a carefree youth, but the hard-won freedom of a soul that had been scarred but not broken. I knew the road ahead might be fraught with new challenges, new betrayals even, but I also knew that I had learned what it meant to truly let go. For the first time in 6 long years, I allowed myself to look forward without the heavy burden of the past. The house, the lies, the faces of those who had shattered my trust. They were all behind me now, like remnants of a faded dream. I had taken back control of my life, and with that control came a powerful, if bittersweet, sense of liberation. So, I kept driving, the headlights cutting through the darkness, each passing mile a small victory over the life I had left behind. The world was wide open, and I was finally free to explore it on my own terms. There was no looking back, only the promise of tomorrow and the quiet thrill of a future that was entirely my own.